They say betrayal cuts deepest when it comes from family. I used to nod at that phrase, thinking it was just a saying people tossed around after arguments. But I learned the truth the hard way. And when the knife finally came, it wasn't from a stranger or a business partner or even my wife. It was from my own son. My name is Richard Cole. I wasn't born rich. My parents died young, and I grew up working odd jobs just to put food on the table. Every brick of the house I eventually owned, every dollar in my savings, was earned through sweat, calloused hands, and years of sacrifice. I wasn't the smartest man, but I was relentless. I married young, and when my wife passed away a decade later, the only thing that kept me going was my boy Mark. He was everything to me. I swore that whatever I had to endure, he would never know the kind of struggle I went through. I worked double shifts, passed on vacations, and skipped meals to pay for his schooling, his sports, his dreams. I wasn't just his father, I was his safety net, his biggest fan, and sometimes, his only friend. When people asked me why I worked so hard, I'd answer with one word: Mark. He was my future. My pride. My legacy. But here's the thing about giving someone everything: they start to believe they're entitled to it. By the time Mark was in his mid-20s, I noticed the shift. The boy who once begged me to come watch his baseball games now barely looked up from his phone when I walked into the room. The kid who used to beam with pride when I bought him new shoes now demanded luxury brands I could hardly afford. He started talking about my house as if it was already his, my savings as if they were just waiting to be spent. At first, I chalked it up to youth. Maybe entitlement was just a phase. Maybe once he stood on his own 2 feet, he'd appreciate what he had. But deep down, a knot began forming in my gut. It grew worse after college. He refused steady work, hopping from one job to the next, always quitting when things got tough. Yet he lived as though money fell from the sky. Nights out with friends, new gadgets, clothes I'd never buy for myself. And whenever I questioned it, he'd throw my own sacrifices back at me. You worked hard so I wouldn't have to struggle, right? Isn't that the point? I wanted to believe he was just lost, that he'd find his way. But looking back now, I realized those were the first cracks in the illusion I had built around him. Because while I still saw him as my boy, the one I'd die for, Mark had started to see me as nothing more than a stepping stone. The final straw, the one that set everything in motion, came the year I turned 55. I had been working for decades at the construction firm, scraping and saving, when a land deal I'd invested in unexpectedly paid off. It wasn't lottery money, but it was enough to change our lives forever. A windfall I never thought I'd see. When I told Mark, his eyes lit up, not with pride, not with happiness for me, but with something darker. Hunger. It was the same look a vulture gives a carcass. At first, he played the role of the dutiful son, congratulating me, talking about how we could finally live better. But his words always circled back to him. His dream car. His business ideas. His plans for the house. And that's when the chill hit me. I thought I was building a future for my son. What I didn't realize was that my son was already planning how to take it all from me. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, the weight of years pressing down on me. I thought of every sacrifice, every blistered hand, every meal I had skipped so he could eat. I thought of the boy who used to hug me tight and say I was his hero. And then I thought of the man who now looked at me not as a father, but as an obstacle between him and the life he thought he deserved. I didn't know how far he was willing to go. But soon I'd find out. And when I did, I swore to myself, if my own son wanted a war for my legacy, he was going to learn just how dangerous a man like me could be. The weeks after that land deal were the beginning of the end, though I didn't recognize it at the time. At first, I was proud to have something solid to pass down. For the first time in my life, I wasn't counting pennies or working myself into the ground just to stay afloat. I thought maybe this was the turning point, not just for me, but for Mark. But money doesn't change people. It only shows you who they really were all along. At first, it was subtle. Mark started dropping hints about how I should relax more, how I didn't need to manage everything anymore. He volunteered to handle bills, property taxes, small things that seemed harmless. I wanted to believe he was finally stepping up, so I let him. But then, little things started slipping. Notices I hadn't seen before. Charges on accounts I didn't remember authorizing. When I asked him, he brushed it off with that slick grin of his. "Don't worry, Dad. I got it covered." It wasn't long before the suggestions turned into demands. He wanted a new car, something flashy imported. When I hesitated, he guilted me. "You've had your turn, Dad. Isn't it my time now?" Then it was business opportunities, half-baked schemes that needed thousands of dollars up front. Every conversation circled back to what he deserved. The worst part? He didn't even try to hide his resentment anymore. If I didn't give him what he wanted, he'd sulk, sometimes rage. He made me feel like a stranger in my own house. And then came the papers. One evening, he slid a stack of documents across the kitchen table. He said it was just estate planning, something to make sure everything was in order in case anything happened to me. I picked them up, and my blood ran cold. They weren't just estate documents, they were transfer forms. Signatures that would give him access to my investments, my property, even my bank accounts. He tried to make it sound harmless. "It's just a precaution, Dad. You trust me, don't you?" That was the first time I saw it clearly. This wasn't about helping me. This was about taking everything while I was still alive. I didn't sign. Not that night. I mumbled something about needing to think, then tucked the papers away. But the damage was done. From that moment on, I saw my son differently. Not as the boy I had raised, but as a predator circling, waiting for me to stumble. The pressure only grew. He started bringing up those papers daily, sometimes aggressively. He talked about how his friends already had trust funds, how their fathers took care of them. He twisted my sacrifices into failures, saying I owed him more. And then he crossed a line I never thought my son would cross. One afternoon, I came home early from a doctor's appointment. The house was quiet, too quiet. When I walked into my office, I found Mark at my desk, rifling through drawers. He didn't even flinch when I caught him. He just looked up, smirked, and said he was helping organize things. But the papers in his hands weren't junk mail, they were my financial records. That night, I sat alone in the living room, staring at the walls I had built with my own 2 hands, and realized I was living with a stranger. Mark wasn't waiting for me to pass on a legacy. He was trying to steal it while I was still breathing. And the worst part? I had no one to blame but myself. I had raised him this way. I had given him everything, thinking love was enough to shape him into a good man. But love without boundaries breeds entitlement. And entitlement, unchecked, becomes betrayal. The father in me wanted to believe I could still save him, guide him back. But the man in me, the one who had clawed his way out of nothing, knew better. Mark had declared war. And if he wanted to take everything from me, then I was going to show him that I was not a man to be underestimated. The night I caught Mark going through my desk, something in me snapped. Not in a way that made me explode with anger, but in a way that made me go quiet. Deadly quiet. For most of my life, I had been a man of action, someone who spoke his mind. But in that moment, I realized anger would only feed him. What he wanted was confrontation, an excuse to paint me as the unreasonable old man standing in the way of his future. So I gave him nothing. I smiled. I nodded. I let him believe I was still the trusting father he could manipulate. On the surface, nothing had changed. But inside, every fiber of me was shifting. I was no longer the man trying to protect my son. I had become the man preparing to defend everything I had built. The first step was control. Quietly, I pulled my accounts from joint access. I moved assets into trusts Mark didn't know existed. I met with a lawyer, an old friend who had handled property deals for me years ago. We spent hours drafting documents, creating a safety net around my finances that no amount of pressure could pierce. At home, I played dumb. I let Mark think I was still considering those papers he'd given me. Sometimes I'd even asked him small questions, pretending to be unsure, to keep him satisfied that his plan was still working. The more I feigned ignorance, the bolder he became. I started noticing things, little slips he didn't realize I caught. Phone calls in the middle of the night. Whispered conversations about timelines and next steps. He thought I was blind to it all, but I was listening, recording, documenting. I even hired a private investigator. It wasn't cheap, but the man was thorough. Within weeks, I had proof of everything. Mark meeting with shady acquaintances, discussing ways to access funds, even boasting about how his father was too old to understand what was happening. Every photo, every recording, every note was filed neatly into a folder I kept hidden away. Each piece of evidence felt like a dagger in my chest, but it also steeled my resolve. If he wanted war, I was building my arsenal. The hardest part was the act. Pretending I didn't know. Pretending I was still the naive father, while my heart broke a little more every time I looked at him. I'd sit across the dinner table, nodding as he talked about the future, all while knowing that future didn't include me. And yet, patience became my greatest weapon. Every day I held my tongue, I grew stronger. Every smile I forced gave me more time to prepare. And the more Mark underestimated me, the sharper my edge became. The investigators' reports painted a picture darker than I ever imagined. Mark wasn't just plotting to take my money, he was preparing to isolate me completely. He had spoken to lawyers about declaring me unfit to manage my own affairs. He had joked with his friends about how long it would take before the house was his. That was the moment I stopped thinking of him as my son. Blood didn't matter anymore. He had made his choice, and I was going to make mine. The plan unfolded slowly, piece by piece. I rewrote my will. I funneled my assets into places Mark couldn't reach. I created layers of protection he couldn't untangle, no matter how many signatures he thought he could trick me into giving. And all the while, I let him believe he was winning. When he asked about the estate papers, I told him I was still reviewing. When he pushed harder, I'd sigh and say, "Maybe soon." Sometimes, I'd even leave documents lying around, fake ones my lawyer helped me draft, so he'd think I was falling for his game. And he bought it. Every single time. But what he didn't know was that I was setting a trap. A trap so airtight that when the time came, he wouldn't just lose his chance at my wealth, he'd lose everything he thought he had. The man who raised him was gone. What stood in his place was someone colder, harder, and far more dangerous. And Mark was about to find out what happens when a son betrays a father who has nothing left to lose. The thing about betrayal is that it blinds the traitor just as much as the victim. Mark thought he was clever, playing his game behind my back. What he never realized was that I had been playing a far bigger game all along. The moment came on a cold Friday morning, months after I first discovered his plan. Mark walked into the kitchen with that smug grin plastered on his face and tossed another set of papers onto the table. These weren't just estate planning documents anymore, they were full-on transfers of authority, the kind that would strip me of control over my own life. He leaned against the counter, arms crossed, eyes locked on me like a predator waiting for his prey to cave. "It's time, Dad," he said, his voice calm but edged with threat. "You've had your turn. Let me handle things now." I looked down at the papers, then up at him. I forced the same weary smile I'd been perfecting for months and nodded. "You're right, son. Maybe it is time." That was all he needed. He thought I had finally broken. What he didn't see was that I had been preparing for this exact moment. The next day, I told him I'd sign, but only in front of a lawyer, to make it official. He agreed, eager to get it done. What he didn't know was that I had already arranged everything with my own attorney, a man I trusted with my life. When we walked into that office, Mark strutted in like he owned the place. He slid the papers across the desk, already imagining the future where everything of mine was his. My attorney glanced at them, then at me, and nodded. That was the signal. I reached into my bag and pulled out a thick folder, the one I had been building for months. I laid it on the table with a weighty thud. Inside was everything: photographs, bank statements, recordings, investigator reports. Page after page of Mark plotting, scheming, and trying to declare me incompetent. Mark froze. For the first time in months, the arrogance slipped from his face. He tried to laugh it off, but the evidence spoke louder than his words. "This," my attorney said, his voice calm but sharp, "is more than enough to prove malicious intent. You've left a trail so wide, it would take a blind man to miss it." Mark's face went pale. He stammered, tried to backtrack, but the walls were already closing in. And then came the final blow. I pulled out my newly signed will and placed it on top of the folder. Unlike the one Mark thought I'd drafted, this one left him with nothing. Not a dime. Every asset had been rerouted into trusts, charities, and accounts he could never touch. I leaned back in my chair and looked him dead in the eye. "You wanted control, Mark. Now you have none." The silence in that room was deafening. He opened his mouth, closed it, then finally stormed out, slamming the door so hard the glass rattled. But the damage was done, not to me, but to him. By the time he realized what had happened, word had spread. Family, friends, neighbors, even some of his own so-called allies knew the truth. His reputation was in shambles. Nobody wanted to be associated with the son who tried to strip his father of everything. And me? For the first time in years I felt free. The weight that had been crushing me, the doubt, the fear, the heartbreak, lifted the moment I saw the look in his eyes as he realized he had lost. That night, I sat at my desk, staring at the final stack of documents. My assets were protected, my legacy secure, and my son's schemes destroyed. The war was over. Or so I thought. Because betrayal, I would soon learn, doesn't die easily. And though I had taken everything from him on paper, Mark wasn't finished with me yet. After that day in the lawyer's office, I thought I'd feel nothing but relief. In some ways I did. My finances were secure, my home was safe, and Mark had been stripped of the power he craved. I had won the battle. But winning against your own blood doesn't come without scars. For weeks afterward, the house felt emptier than ever. Not because Mark had left. Truthfully, he'd been absent in spirit for years, but because the final thread that tied us together had been cut. I sat alone in the same kitchen where I once watched him do homework, the same living room where he tore open Christmas presents, and I asked myself how things had gone so wrong. I had given him everything. My youth, my strength, my sacrifices. And in return, he had given me betrayal. He didn't disappear quietly. He lashed out, as I knew he would. He spread rumors, painted himself as the victim, told anyone who would listen that I was a cruel, paranoid old man who had cut his son out of his life. But gossip can only go so far when there's proof of the truth. The investigators' reports, the documents, the recordings, they spoke louder than his lies. Slowly, the whispers faded. Friends distanced themselves from him. Even the people he thought were allies began to see him for what he was. Still, a part of me mourned. Because while I had destroyed my enemy, I had also lost my son. The hardest moment came one evening when I found an old photograph tucked into a drawer. Mark couldn't have been more than 6, his arm thrown around my shoulders, his smile so wide it nearly split his face. I stared at that picture for a long time, wondering if that boy had ever really existed, or if I had just imagined him. But sentimentality is dangerous. It softens you, makes you forget. And I couldn't afford to forget. One final meeting with my lawyer sealed everything. My assets were now protected by ironclad trusts. A portion would go to charities I cared about, another to scholarships for kids who grew up like I did, with nothing. The rest was locked in a way that Mark would never touch, not in this lifetime, or the next. When the papers were signed, my lawyer looked at me with quiet sympathy. "Are you sure you don't want to leave him anything? Even a small portion?" I shook my head. "A man who tries to steal from you while you're alive doesn't deserve to inherit when you're gone." And that was that. The day I told Mark, his face twisted with fury. He screamed, cursed, swore he'd find a way to undo it. But there was no undoing it. Every move he made had been anticipated, every loophole sealed. I let him rage, let him exhaust himself, then I walked away. For the first time in years, I walked away without looking back. These days, my life is quieter. I spend mornings on the porch, watching the sun rise over the land I fought to protect. I tend to my garden, read books I never had time for, and breathe a little easier knowing I am no longer at war in my own home. But sometimes, late at night, I catch myself thinking about him. About the boy I raised, the man he became, and the line he chose to cross. I wonder if he ever thinks about me, not as the father who denied him, but as the man who taught him a lesson he'll never forget. People say revenge doesn't heal, that it leaves you hollow. Maybe they're right. I don't feel joy in what I did, but I do feel peace. And in a world where your own blood can turn on you, peace is the closest thing to victory. If there's one thing I've learned, it's this: family isn't about blood. It's about loyalty. And when loyalty dies, blood means nothing. Mark wanted everything I had. In the end, I gave him nothing. And I walked away free.